Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm your host, Shrikrishna Upadhyaya, and my guest on the show today is Pranay Kotasthane, Deputy Director at Takshashila and the author of the famous newsletter Anticipating the Unintended. Welcome on board, Pranay.
Yeah, thanks, Sri. I don't know why you called it famous. It's like a famous movie or something. It's hardly read by a few people.
No, because now you have a book out of it, and that book is number one on Amazon. So that is why I called it famous.
Okay.
Right. So the reason I started off by mentioning your newsletter is because you had a very interesting piece in there about Central Board for Film Certification, which is our Censor Board, or as you like to call it, Casually Banning Films Committee. Right? Because it is very trigger happy when it comes to demanding cuts and modifications in movies before it approves a movie for public exhibition in India. And at the same time, sometimes it even refuses to certify movies because it finds it problematic on n number of grounds that it is mandated to look at. So I have let's begin this discussion by putting up two questions for discussion. Right? First is, why do we have a censor board? And second is, India is a state which has weak state capacity. It is unable to deliver basic public services in a judicious manner to most of its citizens. Public health, public education, public transport, infrastructure, everything is lagging. So despite all this, why is our state expending resources on certifying movies and deciding what you and I can watch and enjoy?
Yeah, sure. So, Shri, there's a lot of legal elements here, which I'm sure you're more well equipped to tackle than I am. But let's begin with this idea, right? So, first of all, what has happened recently? Broadly, CBFC is a board for film certification, right? So, as the name suggests, its job should be to certify movies. But it is a lot more than that. And the colloquial name, which is Censor Board, actually captures what it does in reality, right? So it can literally demand cuts of scenes. It can also, on many occasions, it has refused to even give an approval to movies, etc., right? So that was always happening. I mean, the CBFC was formed under the Cinematograph Act of 1952, and then there have been several court rulings which have upheld its powers over the years, right? But over the last few years, and there have been multiple reports, it has become to light that apart from demanding cuts of scenes which show sexual content, violence, or abusive language, which was the supposed purpose of something like a censor board, it has now gone on to do a lot more. So there's a very nice report by Arun Deep in the Hindu recently, I think a couple of weeks ago, where he highlights how the CBFC has expanded its powers to many domains. So for example, it has a perspective on dietary preferences. So it has demanded that the mere mention of beef be struck off in some movie. It also has a take on foreign policy. I mean, you will be surprised to know it is demanding that in some movies, if there's a reference to ex-KGB officers, that should be cut off. And I think, was it in Pathan or something, they converted that ex-KGB into the ex-Ukrainian Secret Service agency. Yeah. And then even references to China and Pakistan in some movies.
No, that was in line with our foreign policy, right?
Yeah, I mean, even a movie is supposed to not have an alternate view on foreign policy. So that was very different. And anyways, Indian foreign policy is not as if that we can't talk about ex-KGB or something like that, right? It's very strange. It's not even in line with our foreign policy, to be precise. But anyways, this is what CBFC is now doing. And in some movies, that article highlights, it has also removed scenes where a police officer is shown to be accepting a bribe. I mean, of course, that never happens in India, right? So it's strange how CBFC is now doing a lot more than what it was trying to do, right? It's become this omniscient body which is trying to do all these things. So this is like one part of the story. But not only has CBFC become this body which tries to become a foreign policy analyst and a dietary preference analyst, there are still people who are unsatisfied with this hyperactive censor board. So, in fact, there was a report in the Indian Express which showed that there was one religious group leader who called for creating a dharma censor board. What he says is that we should review Bollywood films and keep a check on anti-religious content or distortion of fact about Sanatana Dharma and things like that. So actually what he said about this, of course, it is quite ludicrous, but what he says about creating a different censor board or a different certifying agency was an interesting way to look at how we can reform the entire CBFC apparatus in favor of a solution which is more liberal, and we'll talk about that later. But also this is the second line, and then the third element which has happened is just this Sham Benegal committee, which I think 5-6 years ago had come up with a much liberal form of interpreting this CBFC, which had said that CBFC should go back to being a certifying agency. It can't demand cuts, it can't sort of censor a movie, it can only certify, and they had many guidelines on that. But of course it never got approved, and I don't know where that is currently. Shri, do you know what has happened to that committee report?
Yeah, definitely. I'll come to the committee report. But before that, just a bit of history of CBFC and the law under which it has been set up, right? And funnily enough, you said that, colloquially it's known as Censor Board, but till 1983, it was actually called the Censor Board, right? Till the 1983 guidelines came in and they modified it. Before that, the name of the authority was Central Board of Film Censors. Only later did they change it to Central Board of Film Certification. But that trivia point aside, if you look at the Cinematograph Act itself, there are two structural issues which I can find, right? So first is the remit of the CBFC itself is very wide. In the sense, it is, of course, the job is to certify movies for public exhibition, and there are three categories of certification which are already provided in the law. First being universal, second being adult, and third being universal under adult supervision. Of course, there's a fourth category which is special, which is restricted to a particular class, say doctors and so on. But the problem arises due to this idea of guidelines. Now, on the what basis should CBFC certify the movies, right? So, under one of the provisions of the law, the central government is empowered to issue guidelines which will guide the CBFC and its regional officers which do the job of giving these certificates to the films, right? And now these guidelines are first very broad, and they include all kinds of things which should not go into certifying the movie. For example, some of the things are, dual meaning words which are obviously to cater to baser instincts should not be allowed, right? Or then you have these broad yeah, so you can't have, say, a sexual innuendo because that is catering to baser instincts in human beings, right? So that is the state of guidelines. And otherwise you have these very broad provisions like sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly or relations with foreign states, public order, and so on. So the problem is, how do you interpret these things? Of course, they have just copy pasted whatever restrictions are there in Article 19.2 of the Constitution, which are the reasonable restrictions on free speech, and directly pasted them onto here without giving much thought as to what can constitute this. So this is not exactly a guideline as much as it is a provision of law being restated. So there is definitely a problem with this guidelines which are guiding the decisions of CBFC today. The second thing is the supervision and control that the central government exercises over the CBFC, right? It is by no means an independent body. The members are appointed directly by the central government, and they more or less enjoy their tenure on the wishes of the central government. And central government has wider powers to sort of issue directions, orders to the central Board of Film Certification. So which essentially means that whatever your Ministry of IB is deciding is going to be implemented by CBFC, and they do not have any independent authority to stand up to the government in power. So having said that, going back to your question about Sham Benegal's committee, right? So this was set up in 2015-16, if I remember correctly. And they came out with an excellent report, which basically said that, CBFC should just be giving certificates to the movies. Their job is not to demand cuts and modifications and changes in storyline. These days, so even the clothes which are worn by actors in movies. So it's none of that. It should fall within their remit. And they should go back to the job of telling, whether a particular movie can be exhibited universally or under adult supervision and so on. They also gave very good recommendations on the guidelines. They said that, things like if the movie is promoting value sensitive to the society, or if it's providing a clean and healthy entertainment, and all should not exist. These are irrelevant. The core objective should be to protect the artistic expression and creative freedom of the filmmakers. And it actually gave around three categories of guidelines: general guidelines, issue related guidelines, and the third one called category specific guidelines. So without going too much into details, it sort of tried to overhaul the entire system of certification and the guidelines based on the certification. Now, what happened to this is interesting. It's been put in cold storage, to say it simply. But in 2021, the government brought a bill for public consultation, a Cinematograph Act Amendment Bill, which what it tried to do was to basically undo a judicial decision. So, in the older act, the government had certain revisional powers, which said that even after the CBFC has examined a movie and issued a certificate, the central government can decide to resign the certificate, or make modifications, or ask the CBFC to re-examine the particular certificate. So essentially we had a censor board and a super censor board in the form of our central government, right?
Yeah, so even
So
the censor board could be censored.
exactly. So there was a monitor keeping a check on the censor board. So this was held to be unconstitutional by the Karnataka High Court in the 1991, and later on the Supreme Court affirmed it. They said that no, once a movie has been certified by CBFC, the buck stops there, and the government cannot intervene again. But ignoring all the fantastic recommendations made by the Shyam Benegal Committee, the 2021 bill said we will bring this back in a different manner by inserting language in the act which said that the government can ask the central board to re-examine the certificate granted to a particular movie. There were a couple of good provisions as well. For example, the certificate which is given to a movie today is valid only for 10 years. Okay, this is funny because after 10 years you have to go again and apply for a new certificate. So I don't know how Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge is doing this, because it's running since
Yeah.
1996. They are
Yeah.
continuously renewing their certificate. But the point being, finally what happened to this 2021 amendment was that was also put into cold storage, and thankfully that was not passed. But the CBFC continues in essence the way it is continuing for the last 70 odd years. So that's where we are at, Pranay.
Right, right. Very interesting. So basically, we are going in the direction which is quite opposite to what the Shyam Benegal committee talked about, right? And that's quite shocking actually, and worrying also. And there were a couple of other changes, right? The fact that currently CBFC was only looking at movies, and then they were also wanting to expand that to the OTT content, right? So there will basically the CBFC would like any other administrative body would want to have greater powers, and they also want to have control over the OTT content. So I don't know what has happened to that, since does the CBFC now have powers to control OTT content? I don't think so. We don't see any certifications on
Yeah.
stand up acts or something on YouTube yet, right?
Nothing. So far, CBFC has not been given those powers to look into OTT content or any other form of content on social media. Although I think there are certain guidelines now issued by the IB Ministry, and the OTT platforms have also formed a self-regulatory organization like we have for TV broadcasters who have their own program code and so on. So under that, they I think are self-censoring now out of the fear that tomorrow, if they go overboard with their artistic expression, the government will step in and say that, oh no, this should not be allowed, and we will instead bring in a censor board to censor you guys as well. So in order to avoid that eventuality, I think there is a lot of self-censorship which is going on with OTT content. And there has also been other forms of let's call it the heckler's veto, right? How the public can sort of impinge on your freedom of expression by threat of violence, so, or by threat of other legal sanctions which can be used to harass you. So there have been instances in the past when directors and producers have been hauled up. Even I think there was FIRs filed against Amazon Prime CEO and directors, if I remember correctly, for a particular movie or particular TV show which was played on Amazon Prime. So the heckler's
Mm.
veto problem continues. And just to add on to that a bit, there is one more problem, which is that, going back to movies, we have state governments which can essentially suspend a movie even after it has been certified by CBFC. So what I spoke about just
Mm.
a few minutes back was union government trying to usurp those powers to itself, but nothing has been done about the state government's powers, which essentially they continue to enjoy under their individual cinema regulation act. Say a government of UP or Rajasthan can issue a district magistrate can issue an order if they feel that a movie is going to cause breach of peace. But we all know how a heckler's veto operates, right? It is essentially the members of the public who threaten law and order, who threaten peace, and what gets banned is the movie. So that is where we are at.
Yeah, yeah. And there was another angle which was earlier you had this tribunal, right? Film Certification Appellate Tribunal, FCAT. So the idea was that if the CBFC refuses to certify a movie, in that case, filmmakers had an option of the reviewing committee of the CBFC. Even if that fails, they could appeal to this 5-member Delhi based tribunal, and that tribunal was shut down, I think a couple of years ago. The stated intent was that, why have so many more tribunals, and it was part of an ordinance which removed some of these tribunals, and they said that you filmmakers can always have the option to go to high courts and then do that. But we know it just means that it will take a long course, and which filmmaker will want to wait for releasing a movie. So basically FCAT removal is also one thing which is gone in a more adverse direction. And by the way, after that FCAT was shut down, in other countries like in Italy, they abolished all film censorship and actually moved to a self certification system. So there are
Right.
examples where countries are trying to do things in the opposite direction as well. But here we are. So the things have gotten much tougher, and I guess now with this idea of OTT as well, I'm sure there might be things that will go in the direction of restricting what others can do, which for us, where economic, political, social freedom is a very important value to us, this all seems quite saddening. So what are the ways out? Now the Sham Benegal committee report has also not been approved, but I guess let's discuss that.
Yeah, definitely. And just on the FCAT point of view, of course, going to High Court for an individual filmmaker, it is not very accessible to all of them. Now, of course, if you have a big producer like a Yash Raj or Dharma Productions or an Amazon Prime or a Netflix,
Hmm.
they might be willing to spend money, time, effort, resources on going to a High Court and challenging a CBFC order. But a lot of small producers, maybe in regional language or maybe documentary makers, they'll just be forced to accept whatever censor board says because going to a high court is a battle they simply can't afford. But that aside, like you mentioned, like if tomorrow you're also planning to regulate OTT content, and even today regulating films is difficult because essentially it would requires a lot of resources, personal, administrative effort, and so on,
Hmm.
because we have nearly 2,000 odd movies releasing every year, right, in different languages in the country, and this is only going
Hmm.
to go up. And in social media and OTT, I am sure the amount of movies or TV serials which are coming out are, if not less, the same as the movies that we see being displayed in theaters. So it's a matter of resources, it's a matter of the state's capacity. So in this sense, what I found particularly interesting was this paper that you refer to in your newsletter, which essentially said markets have a role to play in film certification, and we can have a privatized market of film certification in our country. And this is an idea I want to come back to. But before that, let's take a short commercial break and we'll be back with more on all things policy. Welcome back to All Things Policy. So, Pranay, let's jump right into it, right? So, if we were to privatize film certification in the country, what will be the structure and why do you think that's a better option than the CBFC that we have today?
Yeah, Shri, just to add to that OTT point as well, I think one connection which we haven't made and people also generally haven't made is that why has OTT content over the years gotten more interesting, whereas films haven't had apart from a few top-notch films, the general median films content has declined, and maybe one of the reasons is because of this as well, because films have all the CBFC things to follow. Why would anyone do that and instead just get things released on OTT now where there
Yeah.
is no regulation? So in fact, one of the reasons why this has happened is because of this regulatory architecture, and that's why we need an improvement. So now coming back to the solutions, yeah, this is from a paper that my former colleagues Madhav, Adheep, Shikha, Siddharth, Devika, and Guru had written way back in 2016 at Takshashila when we were thinking about the Sham Benegal committee report. So we linked this paper, but I thought it's useful to talk about it in the current context. So what the paper proposed initially was that, first of all, CBFC should be doing only certification, no sort of banning films at all, right? So this is the first part. And then we followed a framework in public policy which is about separating steering functions from rowing functions. That is, one body should do just one thing and try to optimize on as less objectives as possible, because if you try to do too many things at once, you end up with an institution which ends up achieving neither of them. So that was the goal. So what the paper proposed was that, first of all, CBFC should be renamed to something called the Indian Movie Authority. And the primary purpose of this Indian Movie Authority is to license and regulate private organizations which are called ICAs, Independent Certifying Authorities. And the certification of the films is done by these ICAs actually, not by the CBFC equivalent, which is called IMA. So IMA only thinks of licensing and regulating these ICAs. So basically, it will try to determine what is the base minimum criteria that every ICA should look at. So maybe they want to ensure, that the sexual content, etc., which is there, that would be defined so that when certification is given on age appropriateness, those things are followed by every ICA at least, right? So the certificate, then going further, the certificate granted by the ICA will just restrict what age groups the film is appropriate for, right? So that is what ICA will do. That's, we think, is the only form of pre-censorship that is required. And then the choice of the ICAs, and this is the interesting part, right? The ICAs can be many variety of different varieties of different types, etc. So as long as that ICA follows a base criteria which the IMA decides, beyond that ICAs can have different categories. So for example, we were discussing about a religious leader who wanted a dharma censor board, right? So basically that type of people can also have a dharma ICA or something like that, which defines their own criteria over and above the criteria which the IMA has determined, and then they can certify whether the film is appropriate to their considerations or not. Okay, so you can have a market of these ICAs which are going on. Now, the thing is that with multiple ICAs being available, there is a choice for producers to approach whichever ICA they deem fit, right? So, and if one ICA gives them a certification which is, adult only, they can go with to another ICA which does not have these strict criteria, right? Or which does not give a dharma censor certificate or something like that, right? You can go to others. So IMA just sets the guidelines for the ICAs to follow, and ICAs can have their own niches of certifying, right? So that is one thing. And as we said, this will allow a marketplace of opportunities for ICAs. Some ICAs can specify in, let's say, children's content. Some ICAs can specify on, maybe religious sensibilities or of whatever. And it's for the producers to choose whichever ICA they want to go. This will sort of help. And the second advantage of this would be that this will help in also leveling the playing field between OTT and films. So basically, currently, as you said, there is no capacity for CBFC to actually look at a broad range of things. But once you have this kind of an architecture, you can have a lot more private players who can do the ICA function, and that will help in at least having a base level of threshold conditions which are met for all content. So this is one example, and the paper talks about more details. So for example, there are considerations like there's a tribunal of movie certification too, which needs to be formed in parallel to the Indian Movie Authority Board. And what this TMC will do essentially is that once an ICA gives a certification, like you said, some state governments might actually have an objection because of law and order considerations, etc. So they can take it to this tribunal. Similarly, producers can also approach the tribunal if they are not happy with the ICA verdict. And this tribunal, which is formed by former Supreme Court judges, etc., can then adjudicate whether the state government's objection is valid or not. If it is valid, they can at the max stop the movie from being shown for a maximum of a week. And after that, again, they have to this consideration has to be taken up. And if they find the state government's objection not sustainable, then they can direct the state government that this movie must be shown and the state government must make adequate security arrangements, right? So there is a backstop for state governments if they think that something is incendiary, and they might want to at least be better prepared for law and order, right? But right at the beginning, we don't need to have any pre-censorship apart from certification under this architecture. So this is an interesting way to look at things, and I would urge our listeners to look at this paper. Maybe this is some solution that they can improve upon and think of as a way forward for India's censor board. So what do you think, Shri?
Right. So I think it's definitely a idea worth discussing and maybe an idea even worth implementing. So a couple of initial thoughts, right? So first is, of course, like you mentioned, the only sort of prior restraint on speech should be, who gets to watch the movie or not. Should children under the age of 18 be allowed something? Should they be allowed only under parental supervision, or should it be restricted to adults? Other than that, I think a respect for individual autonomy and individual rationality requires us to believe that people are the best judges of the choice that we would like to make in terms of movie or OTT or any other content that we like to consume, and just leave it up to them, right? So, and in
Yeah, they are
fact,
already doing that on OTT anyways.
yeah, and in theory, at least, as far as freedom of speech and expression is concerned, prior restraint is always seen with suspicion, except in India, because right now the current guidelines, in fact, I mean, go back to the guidelines I spoke about earlier. It says that you can't certify movies if it has defamatory content about a group or individual. I mean, how is the censor board even supposed to decide if something is defamatory or not? Defamation is actually a legal offense, and a court is the best authority which can rule on whether something is defamatory or not. So it's definitely a case of prior restraint which needs to go away. So I think independent body which can certify films only for age appropriateness is what we needed, and that problem is solved by the framework that you mentioned. The second thought I had was about how this is actually good for consumer choice, right? Now, to draw a parallel with the food market, now you have things like labeling on food packages, right? You have vegetarian, you have non-vegetarian, you say something is free of a certain produce, something is not free of a certain produce. Now we have vegan options, and essentially what it does is it improves consumer choice, it improves consumers ability to make an informed decision. Now, comparing that with the framework that you mentioned, now maybe film producers can get the certificate that they want. If somebody wants, if they believe there's a market for people who would prefer, say, dharmic content, then you might as well go to a Dharma censor board and a content and get a certificate saying that your movie passes the test. And in essence, if it does not get it, if say the Dharma censor board refuses to give that certification, it has immense signaling value. I mean, in India, we love to say it, right? If you don't like it, don't watch it. Now people can actually make a good decision based on this, right? It can say that, oh, my favorite censor board did not give a certificate to this movie, so I'm not going to watch it, right? Instead of having to actually watch it and then decide, oh, maybe I should not have watched it. So yeah, I think these are two of the direct advantages that I see of it. First, it solves the problem of prior restraint to a great extent, and second is that it improves consumers' ability to make informed decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Good example that you said. So that's the idea. Have a marketplace for certification rather than have this idea that there is one government appointed body which tells us as citizens what is good for us and what is bad for us, right? Completely reversing the idea of we the people. So this is something that is one of the ways out. And probably the sad thing though is that we are in an opposite direction, and it requires a lot more people to be talking about this so that the Overton window can be shifted over time.
That's true. But now, a couple more thoughts on the framework, and maybe you can respond to them as well. So, first is this does not really solve the problem of heckler's veto. How do you look at it? Is it actually a law and order problem, or state capacity of law and order, in the sense that we don't have enough police personnel to give protection to movies, right? We don't have enough to solve crimes. So, the easier way the state governments solve the problem is by simply banning it. So, is that something which is getting solved under this framework, or do you think that problem will persist and that's a larger problem that we need to deal with? And the second is, essentially right now, the process of getting your film certified is pretty cheap, right? The fees that you pay to CBFC is very less, it's nominal. And it's a lengthy process, of course, and that involves time and cost. But at least the amount you pay to the board is not so much. It's, I don't know the exact figures, but it is very affordable. But do you think when we have these private ICAs, they might have to, account for their own cost of running the enterprise and their own profit margins and so on, so the prices may go up? And I'm not talking about blockbuster movie producers here. I'm talking about the little ones who may not be able to afford this costly process of certification. So what are your thoughts on these two things?
So on the cost part, actually competition will take care of it, Shri. So the fact that there will be many ICAs,
Hmm.
there can be some ICAs which will specialize in lower cost, right? So it's just like, I mean, you were giving the example of food. There are foods available at different price points, right? You have a cookie biscuit also, and you will also have a Parle G, right? So similarly, there will be ICAs which will charge very heftily, maybe, or there will be also be ICAs which will charge lesser. So maybe they'll charge heftily because they'll make 10,000 people look at the movie first and then give a
Yeah.
certification that whether what is the the effect that it causes on these people. So you can have various versions of this playing out, and that will take care of the cost. The second part is just that heckler's veto point. See, one thing is, this policy cannot solve the problem that we have low law and order, state capacity, and we don't invest in policing, etc., right? I mean, it's just out of bounds of this policy. That is a bigger issue to be taken care of, and it is in fact the most important issue that our governments must be focusing on instead of all these things. But be that as it may, this has some improvements over the current situation, right? So for example, the TMC, which I told you, the
Hmm.
tribunal. So the state government can plead for a temporary injunction against the exhibition of the film, right? As I said, but that injunction shall lapse after 1 week. Which is
Yeah.
different from the current situation. And that means the entire process from hearing to verdict must also take a week. Again, this is an improvement over the current situation. The standard for objectionability should be whether it violates a law which is already in force. So you can't have a arbitrary standard for blocking this, and that's why TMC should be staffed with people who are judges or retired judges, so that they can just implement. If it is violating an already existing law, then it makes sense, right? But not otherwise. And if then TMC can probably even say that whether some content can be removed from the film, and if the producer is willing to make these cuts, then the exhibition of that film can be allowed. However, if that content is if the producer says that I don't want to remove this, then the TMC can be allowed to say that exhibition of that film in that state will be prohibited, etc., right? And then the producer can go and appeal such a thing to the high court. But if the TMC approves the release of the film, then the state government must provide additional security for the exhibition of the film. So this is something that the Supreme Court has also said earlier. So these
Yeah.
things will be things that have to be coming into balance based on a body which takes a more liberal approach towards movie certification and censorship, right? Rather than the current situation where the censor board can just say that it is not allowed because the state governments will find it difficult to sort of provide security. I mean, why the hell does the state have monopoly over the violence of force if it can't ensure that our freedom to see whatever we want is guaranteed, right? So this is a improvement over the status quo. I don't think it will lead to like a 100% optimal solution to stop heckler's veto, but as we say in policies, we have to look at what is the better or worse rather than the absolute good or absolute bad.
Right. So Before we close this discussion, if we were to have a system which is like the one that you mentioned, where you have private players essentially acting as certification bodies, all of them governed by an independent regulator in the form of Indian Movie Authority, what do you portend the biggest roadblocks to having this? I mean, of course, one is the requirement of the political will and an acceptance that, Indian audiences are grown up, they are mature today, they are exposed to content from world all over, so they should be allowed to make that decision. Apart from that sort of a consciousness and political will, do you foresee any other challenges?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the biggest challenge, what you already mentioned, because we are proposing something which is quite opposite to the current direction of policy making. But let's say, even if the government approves from a very public policy point of view and from a capacity point of view, I think it is important to also understand that even outsourcing this work to ICAs, for example, requires high state capacity, right? So for example, the IMA should be able to, just look at ICAs, how they are performing at a regular intervals of time. They need to also ensure that these licenses can be revoked quickly if ICAs, don't follow the guidelines which have been set by the IMA. So the fact is that even if we transition to the new system, we do require higher state capacity in the IMA. It can't be that, we are just outsourcing and happily just giving this option to ICAs, which then become very bad certifying agencies, right? And these are the kinds of things which often happen in other sectors, and that leads to a situation where people lose trust in this kind of model. So IMA being strong and being equipped properly with intellectual, financial, and human resources is equally critical for the new system to function.
Right. Thanks, Pranay. Thanks for joining me on this conversation. If you have no other closing comments, we can close here.
No, thank you all. And as I said, our listeners, I request them to send in your comments. What do they think of this kind of alternative? And please do read the paper. And if there are suggestions to improve it, we'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Right. So, and also I'm hopeful that one day we'll go back to a central board of film certification rather than the casually banning films committee that we have here. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.